I want to start with the Clippers because we got a lot of new information to digest this week. Paul George, who, like many players nowadays, has his own podcast, went on his show and I thought quite impressively unpacked everything that happened over the last 8 or 9 months. Here's a summary of what he said. In October, the Clippers offered George a 2-year, $60 million extension. He deemed that disrespectful, and he declined. Over the next few months, that per-year salary got up to north of $40 million. George still wasn't interested. In January, Kawhi Leonard signed a 3-year, $153 million extension, and Paul George said that if the Clippers had offered him that exact same deal, he would have signed it. They didn't. After the season, which was one of the most efficient seasons of Paul George's career and the most durable since his days in Oklahoma City, the Clippers did offer that deal. But George, who at this point knew there was going to be a 4-year offer out there for him somewhere, said he would take it only if he could get a no-trade clause. The Clippers said no to that. He then asked for a 4-year deal from the Clippers. The Clippers said no to that. So George went into free agency and signed that 4-year, $212 million deal with Philadelphia. I mean, there was a bunch of other things in this podcast, how he was close to going to Golden State, to how he and Kawhi Leonard almost wound up in Toronto years ago. I didn't know how close that was. I mean, it was really good stuff, during that episode. So what was your takeaway from all that information, that TikTok of events that Paul George provided?
Well, I was, as you just laid out, was really impressed with his recollection of the negotiations because we rarely get a play-by-play of negotiations. It's usually summarized into just, I didn't like the offer, or they lowballed me, or you might hear a figure and it's the initial figure and you don't hear the back and forth and just kind of like he kind of really went through of like, this is what I was thinking when they made this offer, this was my counter, and I thought it was just really fascinating to hear him break it down in the manner that he did. So that was really cool. Like that was one of in my opinion, one of the highlights of like a player podcast. What was just, that's something you're unlikely to get in an interview unless they're willing to share that. So I thought that was really cool. But that aside, as someone like I covered the Clippers for nearly 10 years, including my first 2 years as a beat writer. And one thing I learned with this front office and with this regime is they are nothing if not pragmatic. And it could border on, you could say, a little ruthless because I think with time passing, people forget. But like the Lob City era did not end ceremoniously. Like Chris Paul did not leave on good terms. Blake Griffin left on bad terms when he got traded to Detroit. And there was, I did a big feature when he came back to LA for his first game against the Clippers as a Piston. And both sides had two differing accounts as to how that whole situation went down, the information sharing in terms of the Clippers saying they were up front with Blake, that they were looking to trade him, Blake claiming that was not the case. And it's not to relitigate that situation. I just think that like this was how this era was always going to end if it didn't end with a championship and those guys riding out into the sunset. So it did not surprise me that this is how the situation went down. I also think like once Kawhi Leonard signed that extension in January, this was the way that this was trending. This was the way all the buzz was. He was attached to Philly for a couple of months now, and I wasn't surprised by how that played out either. But I do think it was interesting that like it seemed like there was a moment, I guess, where things could have turned and they could have mended the fence and they could have gotten on the same page, and ultimately that didn't happen. But now if you're the Clippers, like I think the Clippers are still in a better position than some people are saying. Like I've seen people put them at like 9th or 10th in the West. I think if you have a healthy Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, you're going to be better than that. However, there's no guarantees that Kawhi Leonard stays healthy and it stays healthy into the playoffs. So I totally understand. Like, I mean, they definitely took a blow losing Paul George and trying to replace him with Derrick Jones Jr. and Nicholas Batum and Kevin Porter Jr. Like it's like they're certainly worse than they were last season. But I still think Kawhi Leonard, when healthy last year, was a top 10 guy. James Harden had some pretty good moments. And they had that stretch there for about a month and a half where they looked like the best team in basketball. So I know without Paul George, they're probably not going to look that way. But yeah, I wasn't surprised by it just because this is how the Clippers have operated in this era of just like they view stars in a very objective lens. And it's sort of like it's almost the opposite of the Lakers, who have had this tendency to overpay their stars and, and it's been more of like, what have you earned with the franchise? And with the Clippers, it's very much, what have you done for me lately? Where are you at right now? And we're going to operate that way.
But so I get all that, but do you think they were operating objectively and pragmatically, 5-6 years ago when they went out and effectively sold their souls to get Kawhi and Paul George to begin with? I mean, they gave Oklahoma City the kind of draft capital that is still paying off and will continue to pay off for the next couple of years. Like, that to me has to be part of this as well, right? Like they're still paying off the Paul George debt. With I believe they owe a pick next year, and then it's a pick swap the year after that. So they're still paying off that those payments to Oklahoma City. And look, I understand a lot, and we're going to take Paul George's word for all this because we don't have the Clippers version of this story. But like, I get offering him a short-term deal early, a 2-year deal. See if he'll take it. Look, even if it's $45 million, if you keep it at 2 years, that's beneficial for the franchise. But when they gave Kawhi Leonard that 3-year, $150 million deal, for the life of me, I don't know why they wouldn't offer Paul George the exact same thing. I don't. Oh, look, $50 million per year sounds like a massive number, and it is. But in today's NBA, it's the going rate for stars of that caliber. And Paul George was, at that point, in the middle of what was a very good season. The Clippers in January were humming. They were like 16-2 or some kind of stretch they were on. Once the Harden growing pains, they got through all that. I don't know why they wouldn't offer him that deal then. Putting him and Kawhi on the exact same path. That I don't get. Like, that would be my first question to Lawrence Frank and the front office in LA, the next time they speak to the media. Like, you gave Kawhi this deal. Why wouldn't you give Paul George the exact same thing? Now, look, I'm one of the people that happens to think they'll be 9th or 10th in the West. Not because they're a bad team, but because the West is so damn good, right? Like, the teams that were out of the playoff mix last year, whether it's New Orleans, San Antonio, Houston, they're going to be better. The teams at the top, some of them took some hits, but Denver's still going to be Denver, and Dallas got a little bit better with Klay Thompson. I think the Warriors, they'll be right there in that mix. I just think it's going to be tough for the Clippers to win when they're at full strength. And to your point, I don't know if they're going to be at full strength all season long. Is that what do you think of the fact that they didn't give Paul that 3-year extension? Because that to me looms as maybe their biggest error.
Yeah, well, my read on that would then just be that they didn't view him as that caliber of player, fair or not. And I do think if you look at some of his recent playoff numbers, he has tended to, like, the production has dipped, and the scoring efficiency, and he has not been the same caliber of player in the regular season as he's been in the playoffs. Now, I think Paul could flip that and say, at least I've been available compared to Kawhi Leonard, right? But I think, and this gets into, because it was always, and this was always a weird part for me when I was covering them, because I was covering them that summer that they got both of those guys, and I covered their first season together, and they always tried to frame it as it wasn't a 1-2 combo. It was a 1A and a 1A, even though everybody knew Kawhi Leonard was the better player. I mean, he was coming off the 2019 title with the Raptors. At that point, some people considered him the best player in the world. And I think if we're being honest and we're ranking players, like, I think almost unanimously people would have Kawhi Leonard ahead of Paul George, even when factoring in the injury history and some of the concern that comes with that. Kawhi Leonard is on the Olympic team. Paul George is not, just as an example. So I think I guess that's sort of what I was trying to get at, was like, I feel like for them, it's if we don't feel like this player, warrants this type of contract and can help us win a championship, then we're willing to move on. And going back to the Lob City era, it was like with Blake Griffin at that point, they were like, we don't think this guy can be the best player on a championship team anymore. So we're willing to trade him, clean house, and restart this rebuild, and they rebuilt pretty quickly, and they got Kawhi and PG. And I feel like this was their version of, okay, this is how we view Paul. We don't view him as like that top tier, top 15, even top 20 player anymore. We think he's taken a step back, and this is how much we're willing to pay him. And if he's not willing to take that, then we're going to have to move on. But I think the one thing that they sort of miscalculate, and they miscalculated, I think, at this situation, and even with the dealings with Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, where like these guys aren't these guys are humans, and that they're not spreadsheets, and that there's a human element to it that I think they have lacked at times. And that to me is the thing here, where like, sure, in a negotiation, you're going to not start with your best offer, but you clearly lowballed him to the point that he was annoyed and offended throughout this whole process, where had you gone, $5 to $10 million more than that, because what he said, 2 years, $60 million deal was the first offer, and like that's crazy.
Not a real offer.
That's insane.
Not a real offer.
That's not like that. That is offensive. That is offensive. Like if you're Paul George, that is an offensive offer. Like you needed to start it at least at 40 million, I think. So the fact that they started that low, I think kind of poisoned the process. And then it's like a matter of, are you even negotiating in good faith throughout this entire time? So like, I think that's the one thing, if I'm the Clippers, that I need to take a hard look at moving forward, is like, I mean, on the one hand, like they've given the keys to Kawhi, and they've basically done everything he's wanted throughout this process. So like, I'm not going to say that they haven't done any catering to, superstars and sort of that like whole sort of nature of the business. But at the same time, I think when you're negotiating and when you're looking to potentially move on from a star, I think how you handle that matters. And there is a bit of a pattern here of these things really ending in these weird ways with them, where the star comes out feeling like they were offended or blindsided or what not. Yeah.
I just don't know what the play is now moving forward, because look, whatever you think of their slot in the Western Conference next year, they're not a championship team. Even if in the best of scenarios, they're not a championship team. They don't have flexibility this year to do anything. In fact, what to me, what they did this year with the flurry of kind of mid-level signings that they made, it just screamed, I don't want to give a lottery pick to Oklahoma City. Like that was, to me, that's what it felt like. Like we're going to sign a whole bunch of guys that are okay, that can play in our rotation, that will keep us just competitive enough in case Kawhi goes out, to avoid bottoming out and giving Oklahoma City a high draft pick and what is expected to be a great draft next year. Now, I think they've got some flexibility next summer when some of these contracts come off the books, but they've got to start paying guys, right? Like if you want to keep Zubac, you got to pay him. If you want to keep Terrence Mann, you've got to pay him. So they're challenged here. And again, it comes down to this. Like you gave up a lot for Paul George. It didn't work out. A lot of the reasons it didn't work out was because there were injuries, most notably to Kawhi Leonard year after year. But if you're going to try to get something out of this group, you gotta bite the bullet. You gotta keep them together for 3 more years. I mean, all I heard, and I'm sure you heard the same things, for the last 8 months was how, Steve Ballmer wants a competitive team going into that new building. He wants star power. Now he's got some star power in Kawhi and James Harden. By the way, they turned around and gave James Harden 2 years and $70 million. Like that is, who were they competing against with that? Like who was out there willing to offer James Harden that type of deal? I just don't know what the midterm play is. Obviously, you're trying to win with Kawhi Leonard over the next 3 years. To do that, you need more. And say what you want about Paul George, but if Paul George had been back and healthy, him, Kawhi, Harden in the playoffs, that would have been a pretty good mix. It would have been a pretty good starting point to win. So that's my biggest question. Like, where do they go now? Like, what is the what's the next domino to fall? Like, do they trade one of these pieces that they have and try to get somebody that way? Do they try to use some of that flexibility that they might have next summer to sign somebody else? I just don't know. I don't know, man.
And the funny thing with that too, though, is that with the Harden contract, this kind of shows like that they weren't necessarily congruent with how they were handling both guys, because that seems like not necessarily an overpay for James Harden's production, but certainly an overpay given the market. And as you just said, like, who are they competing against? So with Harden, they handled it one way of just like, we're going to throw this guy a contract that he's going to not even have to think about and just sign. And there's going to be no competition in the market, but we're going to keep him happy. And with Paul George, it was like pulling teeth and sort of more like, okay, we're going to go back and forth and we're going to drag this out throughout the season. And then eventually we get to the offer that he wanted from the beginning, but now he wants this no trade clause, and now we're not willing to give it to him. So it was interesting that like they clearly, they were offering Paul George more money than James Harden. So I think they view him in a higher light, but based on at least how they dealt with the personalities, they clearly were just like, with Harden, we're just going to give them this to come to an agreement quickly. With Paul, this is much more of a negotiation, and I think they just miscalculated it.
That's the other thing, too. I would have given them no trade clause. If that's what it came down to, I would have given them that. Because, look, every star player effectively has a no trade clause anyway. Like, you're not trading a star player to a market that he doesn't want to go to, except for the rarest of circumstances, right? Because, you don't want a disgruntled guy. You want a guy that wants to be there, that wants to be part of what you're building with that team. Like, if you're willing to pay the Kawhi Leonard type deal to Paul George, and it came down to giving him that no trade clause, it's 3 years, not 5. Like, you're trying to win, obviously, this year with this group. You'd probably try to win again next year with Harden under contract. The only year that could potentially get dicey is in year 3. And then it's not that you can't trade Paul George. You just need his agreement on a deal. And you can work with them on stuff like that. Say, all right, you give us a list of teams that you want to go to, and we'll come up with a solution. So I'm anxious to have Lawrence Frank sit down and talk again about all this and how it all played out, because I don't know what the calculus here is for the Clippers. I don't know how they get this team with this group on a path to winning a championship.